Good evening all and welcome. Tonight I have a collection of 4 stories with people I'm sure you'd rather never meet again. So, before we jump in, 2 little things. The first thing is don't forget to download our app, iOS and Android. So many stories to listen to, I'm sure you're going to love it. Don't forget to leave us reviews. And the second thing is, the final story is a yarn. It's long, it's a spiral. But when you get to the end, I think the payoff was worth it. So make sure to listen to the end, and hopefully I see you there. But for now, get comfortable and let the darkness take control. Okay, so I'm not conventionally pretty nor classically pretty. I'm the Duffy in any friend group I'm in. I never worried about being hit on, disrespected or kidnapped. I've never had to worry about my own safety when I go out, as I was never the one anyone wanted to get to know or be around because I am so plain. And it's always me that has to be the lookout for my friends, male and female alike. Now I like to go to a local bar almost daily. I don't drink alcohol there, just a normal Coke, and wait for my ride home. It's my usual hangout spot after work, so I just sit and chill and mind my own business. A few weeks ago I'd gotten off work and was just chilling at my usual spot, and sipping on my drink while working on a new pendant I was making. I started wire wrapping crystals into jewellery. I didn't think anyone would try and talk to me since I basically blended into the walls, even though the staff knew me and paid slight attention to me and are nice to me, but this weird guy I'd never seen before came over and sat at my table across from me. I was surprised and looked up at him, and struck up a small conversation that I can't remember how it started, but he began talking to me and asked a few questions about myself, and I thought they were normal and they all flowed together, so I didn't think much of them. Again, I'm plain. I didn't think anyone would want to do anything to me. I had just drank 3 glasses of soda by then, and had to use the restroom, so grabbed my phone and purse and went to the bathroom. I may not have been worried about being abducted, but I did worry about my identity cache and contacts, and I was back a few minutes later and resumed my work. Since none of my stuff had been touched, I called over a waitress and asked her for a new drink, and she nodded, as it had always been ingrained to me that you never leave your drink unattended, and if you do, have it remade or just leave it to the bartender. As she was going to grab my old drink, which I only taken a few sips out of, the guy got a bit huffy at me, saying I was being wasteful just ordering a new drink. I looked at him with a raised eyebrow in confusion. I asked why it was his business if I did. It was my money after all, and the refills were free. He then said I was making more work for the waitress for no reason. This annoyed me, and I again told him that it was my business, and that if he didn't like it, he can always leave. He then tried to wave the waitress off with letting her change my drink, but I'd had enough of his nonsense and told him flat out, "Then you drink it, if you think it's such a waste." It seemed to have caught him off guard, and he looked at me, shocked, and then was a bit angry before leaving. I then looked at the drink and handed it to the waitress and told her that something didn't feel right about the guy, and I asked if the bartender could keep an eye on him, and they'd dump out my drink and just bring me water from then on. I left for home after being picked up shortly after, and found out the next day after work that he had been arrested for assault. I didn't find out till today what exactly happened. Apparently he had gotten into a fight with the bartender working that night. The bartender caught him putting something into a girl's drink when she wasn't looking, and stopped her from drinking it. The guy got so mad it started a whole fight. The cops were called and now he's awaiting trial. Apparently, as he's trying to see if he can get someone like me who's always had her guard down for herself because my confidence was low, he thought I'd be an easy mark with just a little attention. But when I didn't just drink my drink, when I came back he had to try another girl. If he really was targeting me, I have to question his sanity and sobriety. Thank goodness those old lessons about safety growing up. Thank you, Mum and Dad. And to the guy at the bar, let's never meet again. When we are young, preteen and teenage girls, we believe that a prince will come and sweep us off our feet. It's not until we're a bit older that we realize how many creeps use that against us. I had just turned 14 when we finally moved from Texas to Indiana. We moved into this big 3-bedroom house with 3 trailers behind it. In one of those trailers was a guy that would often talk to me. I thought it was cool to have an older man like me. He asked me to be his girlfriend and I accepted. My dad noticed him giving me attention and grounded me from going outside. he got a letter to me, asking me to meet him at the parking lot at midnight. My dumb butt did. When I got there, he had some popcorn and soda for me. My next memory is laying on the merry-go-round with him and another man standing over me. I tried to get up but blacked out again. My next memory is the back of his car driving violently through a cornfield, and my next memory is waking up in my bed with no memory of how I got there. I got up while my dad was at work and went to ask him what happened, but he had packed up and left. Years later, as I was driving down a road that was near the old house when I was passing a cornfield, all of a sudden a memory of that night popped into my head. I remember walking up in that cornfield all alone at midnight. I somehow made it home and got back to bed. I don't know why I couldn't remember this before. Those guys thought I had died and panicked. They drove me to the cornfield and put me out there. It took me years before I realized how close I came to death. So if you lived in a trailer behind a house in Whiteland, Indiana in 1989, I hope you've never hurt any other kids. I am a 27-year-old female-bodied person. A few months ago, my sister and I wanted to take a late-night trip to our local Kroger for a snack. This was before she moved out, and God, do I miss having her in my life. But anyway, as we pulled into the parking lot, there's this beat-up old truck with an older man just sitting there. He looked like he was between 50 and 70. It was hard to tell in the dark, but as I saw him, I got a weird feeling about him. We parked a few feet away and just went on with our business. So we get inside the grocery store, grab what we need, and I got myself and my sister a snack. And my sister got a bottle of wine to share with my mum, as I don't drink. Nothing odd happened in the store until we leave. I noticed that the old pickup truck was now parked next to our Jeep, and I thought it was very odd for the old man to just be parked there when he had several other parking spaces to be. Immediately I get a feeling of dread, as I was a victim of sexual abuse and am typically uncomfortable around older men I don't know. As soon as my sister and I get to the car, the old man steps outside of his vehicle and places his hands on the passenger side door where I would have entered. "Need me to open the door for you, young lady?" he asked in a creepy voice with a smile on his face. No, I think I can get it by myself, thanks. Would you take your hand off the door, please? I'm on the edge, as the look in this guy's eyes spelled nothing but problems. Thankfully, my sister caught wind of my discomfort and slowly began to pull the wine bottle out of her bag. What happened next made me want to crawl out my skin. The old man obliges and takes his hand off the door for a second to place his hand around my waist. I froze and looked at him like, "Are you serious?" And I felt him pull at me ever so slightly. That's when I heard my sister turn the ignition on, and I got in the car as fast as I could, slamming the door shut in the guy's face. My sister then stepped on the gas and peeled out the parking lot, not even giving the guy a chance to look at me. She told me she wondered why it took me so long to get in, but when she realized what was happening, she was going to bash the guy over the head with her wine if it went any further. I then had a mini panic attack on the way back home, and my dad, of course, dismissed my feelings and brushed them off as I told him. As did my mum, unfortunately. I did manage to calm down in the end, and now I asked my sister to park a little closer to the entrance to the stores, where there are a lot of lights, in case anything like this ever happens again. When I was in college, I met this dude called Steve. He was good-looking, well-spoken and confident, and was instantly well-liked by most of the people that he met. But he was a bit intimidating to me at first, due to the fact that he was pretty jacked and didn't speak to me a whole lot in the beginning. Here I am, an 18 going on 19-year-old fat kid with an inferiority complex that made me act out to get attention. I would wear women's clothes to class to get a laugh, or interrupt the professor with a witticism here and a joke there for the laugh. I was that kid, the one people didn't exactly dislike but weren't too eager to hang out with, because I could be a bit much at times. This did nothing to help with my feelings of inadequacy, but I didn't make the connection there until a few years later. Steve and I didn't exactly become fast and hard friends, because I got pretty drunk at a party once and he decided instantly that I was annoying. but we were still civil to each other, as we were in the same department and had a number of classes together. We hung out with different crowds too, even inside the department. Steve had recently been kicked out of boot camp in the military. He told everyone it was because he had injured himself badly enough that he had been discharged. That wasn't true, but we'll get to that later. Cut to about 4 months after me first meeting Steve, and I have been invited by a mutual friend Corey to come to a small get-together at his place, where he incidentally was roommates with Steve. I told Corey that I was kind of wary of Steve and felt that he didn't like me, to which he replied that I was right, and that's why he wanted me to come over. He wanted Steve and I to get to know each other because he was positive we could become friends if we gave each other a shot, and after some prodding I finally agreed. When I arrived at Corey's house, there were maybe 3 other people from the department there. It seemed like a pretty chill setting. There was some alcohol being passed around, and I drank a small amount, but kept my distance from Steve. After a few hours and quite a few beers, I was starting to feel pretty good. Someone brought out a few joints, and those started getting passed around too. When one of them made its way to me, Steve spoke up. "Don't bother passing to him," he said with a mocking laugh. "He's a goody-goody." I'm not sure exactly why he said that, even though I thought that I may have once mentioned in passing that I'd never done weed before, but regardless of why he said it, it made me mad that he was making fun of me. So I did what any 19-year-old drunk dude would do. I grabbed the joint and took the biggest hit anyone could possibly take. This, for anyone who has ever smoked knows, is a huge mistake for a marijuana virgin, when quality kush is handed to him. After my coughing fit, and the laughter that ensued at my expense, I looked at Steve challengingly, and he just nodded in my direction before resuming in his conversation. Now, no one told me that you shouldn't mix weed and alcohol. Had I stopped there, I would have been fine. However, I continued to drink, which worsened everything that came with being high. By the time I knew I was high, I was starting to get paranoid. I am, or at least was, a bit of a hypochondriac. Dry mouth felt like my tongue was swelling up, and my throat was starting to close. The feeling of almost weightlessness that sometimes accompanies being high made me feel like I wasn't anchored to the floor anymore. The time dilation that you experience with weed made me feel like I was frozen in time, and I began to panic. By this point, everyone else had gone home, and it was just me, Steve, and Corey. I explained to Corey that I thought I was allergic to weed because I wasn't feeling right, and oddly enough, Steve explained to me to ask what I was feeling. When I did, he walked me through all of it and calmed me down. Once I was calm, he put a controller in my hand, and we played video games until I sobered up enough to drive. It was honestly really cool of him, and it was the start of one of the best friendships I've ever had, until it became the worst and most abusive relationship I've ever been in. Over the next year or so, Steve and I became really close. I considered him one of my best friends. Being around him was almost like a drug. He just had this way of making you feel like you mattered. I know now that he was a complete sociopath, but you don't really see the signs until it's far too late. He harassed me until I started working out with him, which meant I had more energy and confidence in myself, and got into pretty decent shape. I wasn't ripped, I wasn't even what most people would call fit, but I wasn't the fat kid anymore either. He would come to my house and force me to go out to do stuff. Before I became friends with him, I was kind of a loner and a hermit. We would go to the lake just to dick around or go hiking in the woods or any number of outdoorsy type activities, and for the first time in years I had confidence in myself and was actually quite happy. Enter Lisa, the love of my life, the one who got away, or rather the one that I stupidly dumped twice over a 5-year relationship because I was scared. She's not a huge part of this story, but she plays a role. She had come to my hometown to go to school, and had a boyfriend back home, but we clicked immediately. I know you're wondering, and no, we didn't hook up or anything while she was with him. She made her intentions towards me clear, and I made it clear that nothing would happen while she was dating someone else. She told me she had been considering breaking things off with him, as he was a bit controlling and dickish, and the next day she walked up to me and kissed me full on the mouth, and when I started to push her away, She informed me that they had broken up, and that is how our relationship began. I just would like to let you know that this has nothing to do with Steve, but it was an immensely happy time for my life, and I never would have had the confidence to flirt with Lisa in the first place if it wasn't for Steve. The next year after Lisa and I got together was rather uneventful. I will admit there were some red flags with Steve that I didn't either see or just outright ignored. Looking back on it now, one of the most obvious was that one day I was hanging out with Lisa when Steve showed up. She had always gotten a bad vibe from him, and rightly so. And so when he showed up, she left to go to class 45 minutes early. Watching her walk away, Steve said, "I could take her from you if I wanted." I gave him an incredulous look, slightly panicking that this man who called himself my friend might actually want to, and be able to sway Lisa to date him instead of me. He laughed at my expression and added, "Don't worry, I don't want her. She's a 6 at best, but she's perfect for you. But I prefer my girls a little thinner and much hotter. Just thought you should know that if I wanted to, I could." It should be noted that Lisa was thin, if curvaceous and absolutely gorgeous in a very classical way. I'm now convinced that Steve was actually attracted to her, but he saw himself as the alpha and needed to assert his dominance over me as one of his perceived betas. I'm ashamed to admit that it worked. I did get angry and told him not to talk about my girlfriend in such a gross way, but once he gave a half-hearted apology, I just kind of shrugged it off. The next year, the red flags came up even more, which I chose to ignore. But the first few years weren't really that bad. Steve was starting to show his true colors, but the real horrible stuff was still to come. Also, if you're keeping track, I was at a 2-year college for 3 years. That's just how long it took me to get my associate's degree. That's neither here nor there. Steve started dating one of the freshmen in our department. I heard from others that the relationship was incredibly psychologically abusive on his end, but I kept brushing it off because the girl he was dating hadn't spoken up and Steve was a good guy, right? I mean, I hadn't witnessed it. Other people must have just misinterpreted Steve's unusual sense of humor in a way that painted him in a bad light. I was unaware at the time that of course she wouldn't speak out against him because that's exactly what psychological abuse is. It's gaslighting and insults and ensuring that the victim believes themselves to be absolutely worthless and deserving of the treatment that they receive. During the end of the year departmental party, I proposed to Lisa and she said yes. And when Lisa and I graduated from the college with an associate's degree, we decided to move to a new school together. Despite the fact that our relationship grew stronger than ever without Steve in our lives, a dot that didn't connect due to still being firmly in his psychotic grasp, the college we decided to transfer to was absolute garbage, and after a year there, we decided to transfer again to a better and cheaper school, this time about an hour away. Coincidentally, it was the same school that Steve now attended. That summer, Lisa moved back to her hometown while transitioning between schools, and I ended things with her for the first time over the phone. Shitty, I know. But we were like 5 hours apart, since I had stayed behind to live on campus and work, and neither of us could find the time to visit each other. The only reason I can logically come up with this is that I was scared of the commitment. I've always said that when I marry I want it to be for life, and I got in my own head and started to worry about whether or not Lisa was the person I really wanted to spend the rest of my life with. When I moved to the new city, Steve helped me get an apartment in the same complex where he and Corey, the friend from earlier, both lived. We were in separate buildings, but the apartments were set up in a way that the courtyard between the two buildings was only like 40 feet across. I could actually see into Steve's apartment window from my second floor one when we both had our blinds open. There were many times that I would glance out the window while playing video games or something like that, and Steve would catch my eye and wave over to me. I would immediately turn my game off and head over to his place to smoke a little weed and watch one of his 4 DVDs for the billionth time. During this time in my life, I became a major alcoholic, and I'm fairly certain that Steve realized this was happening but said nothing because he wanted to be able to hold it over me. He may have contributed to my alcoholism a tiny bit. He began to use the same bullying tactics he had once employed to get me to go work out and do things. This time he was using them to get me to go out drinking. If I told him I had class early the next day or homework that needed doing, he would just wave it off and tell me that we would be back in plenty of time to get it done. We would often stay out till 2 in the morning when the bars closed, or later if he met someone cool and decided that we were going to go to their house to hang out for a bit. If I said I didn't have money, he would promise to pay for me, and at the end of the night, I would get a bill I could barely afford, and he would explain that clearly he meant he would pay for the first couple of rounds, and if I drank more it was my fault. Several times I actually had to have him lend me money, just to pay rent, which further put me in his clutches. I would like to take a brief break and address the elephant in the room. I realized that every single one of the previous mentioned problems stemmed from me. I could have moderated my drinking. I could have told him no when he asked me to go out, and I could have realized sooner that he was never truly going to pay my bar tab, or that we weren't going to be home early. And I do take responsibility for all of these things. But that being said, something you have to understand about Steve is that he would gaslight and make me feel like I was being a bad friend if I told him no, despite having a very valid reason for the refusal. What I'm trying to do by telling you this part is point out that he was never the good friend I thought he was. Or he would have pointed out that I was drinking too much. Would it have stopped me? As I know now from the numerous attempts by another true friend, no, it really wouldn't have. But at least in hindsight, I would be able to say, you know what, Steve tried to stop me drinking. He was a good friend. But back to this story. Some few months after moving into the new city, Steve introduced me to a friend of his from out of town, Jennifer. She was a pretty woman with dyed red hair, styled in a pixie cut, thin, and an athletic build with a gorgeous face. She was honestly every straight man's dream. Not only that, but she was intelligent, funny, quick-witted, and compassionate and kind. And I got a bit of a crush on her, but she was way out of my league. I asked Steve if she was seeing anyone, because at this point I still had some confidence. He told me she wasn't, and asked if I liked her. I said I did, and he assured me that he would try and get a feel for what she thought of me. Cut to a few days later, and Steve is now dating her. This confused the hell out of me because when he introduced us, they kept making jokes about how neither of them were really interested in the other, and they would never work as a couple. I think even back then, I knew he had done his psychological messing stuff to get her to date him, so he could once again assert his dominance over me. I shrugged it off, happy that my friend had found a girl to make him forget that freshman he had been dating a few years back. He had constantly moaned about missing her when she finally got the courage to tell him to go do one night after he called her fat. She was maybe 95 pounds. Over the next few weeks, I started to notice that Jem was looking more and more exhausted and haggard. When I asked if she was okay, she would just smile and assure me that her workloads were just getting with her. We had started to become friends, so I asked her not to hesitate in coming to me if there was anything I could do to help. She thanked me for the gesture, but again said she was fine. I would find out later that Steve was treating her in the same way he had treated his previous girlfriend. She apparently told Steve about my offer for help, thinking it was sweet and that I wanted to help her. And as you may have guessed, Steve flew over the handle. I'd never seen him get so angry. He came to my apartment, banged on the door and almost broke it down, screaming at me to get my two-faced ass out into the hallway so that he could kill me. I didn't know it at the time, but Steve had started taking steroids, which explained, to some extent, his unfound rage. After nearly an hour of him pacing in my living room and threatening me and yelling loud enough to wake the whole damn neighborhood, I was finally able to convince him that my attentions were nothing but friendly towards Jen. Bro code. Dictated that even if two of them broke it off, I wasn't going to be pursuing her, since she had dated one of my best friends. Once he finally believed that I wasn't trying to stuff his girl like a Thanksgiving turkey, as he put it, it was like a switch flipped. Suddenly we were best friends again, and his earlier rage seemed to have been forgotten, almost as if it had never happened. He dumped Jen shortly after. My guess is that he realized he had no romantic interest in her anymore, and therefore couldn't use his relationship with her to needle me and control me. I only saw her a handful of times after that, but the last time I saw her she looked so much happier. Yet another sign about Steve I didn't see or chose to ignore. About a month later, Lisa and I got back together. She was incredibly distrustful and wary at me at this point, and rightly so. I had broken her heart for no other reason than I was an idiot. Over time, she began to trust me with her emotions again. This was a mistake on her part, and I don't mean that to sound cruel, Perhaps I had picked up a few things from Steve. I know that I was fairly manipulative. I am much more ashamed of that now than I can ever portray in words, and I hate myself for the way I treated her during our second stint as a couple. Lisa was still uncomfortable around Steve and would often leave if we were hanging out. He never seemed to catch on that she didn't want to be around him. Things were made far worse when we went to a house party one night and Steve groped her. Again, I'm incredibly ashamed to admit of what I did when she came to me in tears of rage and disgust and told me what had happened. I'm ashamed because the first thing out of my mouth was, "Steve wouldn't do that. Maybe you misunderstood what was going on." "He smacked my ass and grabbed my chest," she practically yelled at me. "All right, I'll go talk to him." I should have just cut him off right then and there. I should have taken Lisa home. I should have went to knock Steve out. I should have done a whole lot of things. But I've always been a people pleaser, and Steve brought this out of me in the worst way. When I asked him about it, he told me that he had grabbed her waist to get around her in the kitchen as it was crowded, and that he had accidentally brushed past her breast while reaching for a bottle of rum. And I ate that up. I believed him, and I went back to Lisa and conveyed what had just been told to me. After a lot more enraged tears and yelling, she left. Why she just didn't dump my stupid harassment, apologetic, victim-blaming ass right there, I still don't know. And when Steve appeared a few minutes later, and I explained what happened, he put on a faux sympathetic face and said with a chuckle, "Man, screw that girl. Let's find you a hot, drunk girl who wants to give you a BJ." Even though I knew that that was a huge red flag, and that I did not want to do anything with anyone, I still ignored the signs. I didn't cheat, but I ignored the signs, and Lisa didn't speak to me for a week, and she was right to do so. I think she should have never spoken to me again. Things with Steve were a bit strained and we didn't hang out that much. Things with Lisa improved as Steve wasn't around, and we were talking even about moving in together. This would not ever happen, because I was going to break up with her again before long. I didn't know I was going to do it this time, but it was going to happen, and when it did, there were no tears like the last time, there was no pleading like we could make it work. Lisa simply fixed me in a motionless, almost dead gaze and said, "My sister told me not to trust you again. I should have listened. Get your stuff and get out." Now I really wish she had just left it at that. But over the next few years, we would go on to just have a few stints as friends with benefits. And that just about sums up what became of our relationship, friendship, or facsimile of friendship after a while. Shortly after our breakup, I became immensely depressed. I didn't realize that it was because I was still in love with Lisa. Why would I be? I had broken things off with her. Regardless, I started drinking even more and stopped working out, and started regaining all the weight I had lost in my freshman year of college. Steve noticed, regarding that I was a fat turd. I never really minded it because I was used to my weight being the butt of every other joke. Besides, he always said it with a laugh to let me know that he was only joking. The way good friends always insult each other, right? At the same time, I started hanging out with him again. One day he came to me asking if I wanted to move into a house with him, and I politely declined because I liked living alone, and my rent was relatively cheap for where I lived. He obviously called me some names and got unreasonably angry, saying that I owed him everything. He then screamed at me for half an hour and didn't speak to me for 3 days, but did eventually calm down. He never apologized for his outburst though, and when he moved out, another mutual friend took his apartment after having just gone through a bad breakup of his own, and I started hanging out with his new friend Mark quite a bit, since he lived just across the courtyard and Steve was a few miles away. During this time I met a man through Mark who would go on to become one of my 2 best friends that I had ever met. Enter Nick. Remember the friend from earlier who I said regularly tried to get me to stop drinking? That's Nick. He was and is a man who, for some reason, I never want to disappoint. Even today, being mostly sober, a huge part of what keeps me from drinking is the idea that if Nick ever found out, I would be more ashamed of myself than if I publicly crapped my pants in front of the woman of my dreams. Personally, to me, that's a mark of true friendship, mostly because Nick never asked or expected anything of me. In fact, I think he's a little uncomfortable to be with, but not something I can just turn off. Nick and I hit it off fairly quickly and started hanging out regularly. It was with Nick and his circle of friends, all of whom I now proudly know as my own friends, that a Dungeons & Dragons group was started that lasted for nearly 4 years. Nick plays a bigger, if not huge, part in this story later. Things continued in this way for maybe half a year before I finally decided to take Steve up on his offer and move into the house with him, mostly because money was tight and my bills would go down. His current roommates had moved away for whatever reason, and he had a few vacancies. I took one room, and a friend of his from when he was in boot camp, Greg, took the other. For a while, thinking things were awesome, Steve had apparently become Catholic. He was off the juice. It was like I had my old friend back from the days when we had started becoming chummy. He, Greg, and I would often go on road trips or just go out to bars or go to some outdoor attractions around the city and walk around. Now remember that I said Steve had been discharged for the military and claimed that it was due to an injury? Turns out it wasn't true at all. One night while Steve was at work, Greg and I were hanging out with some beers, and somehow the topic came up. "You know, he was just crazy, right?" Greg asked. "What do you mean?" "He got kicked out before he finished boot camp." "Really? He told me he suffered some kind of injury and they had to let him go." After I said this, an incredulous look came over Greg's face and he turned slowly to look at me. He told me that Steve had reason to suspect that his then wife was cheating on him and had been overheard by a commanding officer saying that when he's finished with boot camp he was going to go murder both of them and the daughter that he and his wife had. He had been given an in-depth psychological evaluation and been discharged essentially for being too insane for the military. I later confirmed this with some of Steve's childhood friends. At this point I was starting to realize who Steve really was, thinking back on some of the interactions I'd had with him. Unfortunately, I was stupidly loyal to someone I perceived to be a good friend. At some point, I had invited Nick to come over and hang out to play video games and whatnot, and when Steve met Nick, he immediately called him fat. Now, Nick was at the time a large man. He has since made enormous strides in his fitness journey. Shout out to Nick for all your hard work. If you're listening to this, you look great. And regardless, I remember the look of utter disbelief on Nick's face. But I defended Steve, saying that that's just how he made friends. If he wasn't calling you names, then it meant he didn't like you, lol. By the way, just as a side point, can we stop that? Treating people like crap is not a way to break the ice, it's terrible. And I'm guilty of doing this in the past, and I hate that I used to do it. Anyway, not relevant. I could tell Nick was skeptical, but he just kind of went with it. I think he kind of resented me for not defending him, but never said so. After a few weeks after the conversation with Greg, Steve had a friend of his from out of town stay with us for the weekend. Greg was out of town for some reason. But before Steve's friend arrived, he told me that she was fat, but pretty, and that if I wanted her, I had his blessing. This did not sit well with me because not only of how he described her, which I learnt wasn't true when she arrived, but because he felt the need to give his permission for two of his friends to have relations with each other. I kept my mouth shut though. I forgot the woman's name, but she was very pretty, curvaceous, but in no way fat. I was confused as to why Steve would describe her in this way. She and I got along really well from the start, and she and Steve slept together. Again, I'm fairly certain he slept with her because he could tell I was taking a liking to her. I wasn't falling over myself to get into a relationship with her, but I did think she was quite nice. Steve had to once again assert his dominance over me. The next day we all had lunch at a local restaurant, and Steve essentially left his friend and myself to drive his car back to the house while he wandered off to do God knows what. I was infuriated that he would do that. Not necessarily the leave us part, but the fact that his friend had come to town specifically to visit him and he just bailed on her with no reason. She and I spent the day watching movies and playing video games, and we talked quite a bit about Steve, as he was our one common link. And a lot of things came to light about Steve. I messaged him multiple times throughout the day asking where he was, and he didn't respond until about midnight. I sent a text telling him it was kind of crappy to just leave his friend with me, as she had come to see him, and the text I got back just read, "Mind your business, fatty, I'll be home when I get home." He finally rolled up around 10 the next morning when his friend was getting ready to leave. He was driving a motorcycle that I'd never seen before. He barely said goodbye to the woman as she was leaving, and when the door closed I rounded on him, asking where he was, feeling myself get angrier by the word. Not that it's any of your business, but I was helping a friend bury a body. He shot back as he walked into his room. I knew instantly that this was a lie. I just had this intuition when it came to Steve. I could almost tell when he was lying, and this one was just so outlandish that I didn't even need to consider it. "No, you weren't," I said under my breath. "What was that, fatty?" he said, coming back to me in the room shirtless, getting in my face. I gently pushed him away from me and he looked utter dumbfounded. He couldn't believe I would ever stand up to him like this. "I said you're lying," I retorted quickly. "But if you want to treat your friends like crap, when they travel 4 hours just to hang out with you for a few days, be my guest." We stood there glaring at each other for a few seconds before he deflated and looked slightly ashamed, which shocked the hell out of me. "I was with a girl I've been dating," he said softly. "So you invited a friend to stay with us," I said, my anger rising again, "and cheated on your girlfriend with her and bailed on us and then lied to me about it? Screw you, douchebag." I turned on my heel and stormed to my room. I'm fairly certain Steve then threw a projectile at me but missed, because I had a thump on the wall to my left of the doorway as I walked through it. I didn't stop to find out. I didn't speak to Steve for a few days after that, and it wasn't until Greg returned from his trip and noticed that we weren't spending time together and were acting coldly towards one another that our friendship started to repair a bit. Mostly due to Greg yelling at us that he wasn't going to live with a few girls who couldn't get their act together and act like adults. Despite our relationship repairing slightly, things were never really the same after that. Over the next few months, Steve started to sell drugs and always kept a loaded gun in the house. I specifically remember him telling me one day that some guy was going to be coming over to give him some money that he was owed, and if he showed up while Steve was at work, I was supposed to take the money, count it, and put it in his bedroom desk. I didn't know he was dealing at the time, and so assumed the guy just owed him money. I just agreed and went back to playing video games, as he left for work. Steve got home from work before the guy showed up, and when there was a knock at the door, Steve came out of his room with his gun in hand and held a finger to his lips. He opened the door to reveal a man standing in the porch with a wad of cash in his hand. Steve immediately pointed the gun in his face, cocked the hammer back, and started screaming at him to drop the money on the ground and get off his porch. As the dude was fleeing in terror, Steve yelled at him that if he ever saw him again, he would end him. Of course, I was immediately distressed by what I had just witnessed, but I was equally terrified when he turned to me with a huge grin after collecting the money from the porch and closing the door. I just gave a weak smile and ignored the whole thing, and learned later that he was back on the steroids when this happened. During this time, Steve would regularly come home late at night, 3 sheets to the wind, ranting about one ethnic group or another. The one thing that sticks out in my mind the most was when he stumbled in so drunk that he could barely string together a coherent thought. He was yelling about globalism and how the Chinese were trying to take over the world. He mumbled a string of words I couldn't make out and then shouted, "Pingling!" followed by another string of unintelligible and crazy words, and finally, "Screwing our daughters," were the last words that left his lips, and he immediately fell to the floor and began to sob. I had no idea what to do. If I tried to help him, I knew he would get violent towards me. In the end, I did nothing and went to my room. A few weeks after that particularly charming incident, Steve and I got into an argument about something that I can't remember. He stormed off to his room and I thought it was over. I knew from experience that given time and distance he would calm down, but would never apologize. At least the situation would de-escalate, but I was wrong this time. 10 minutes later, he came crashing back into the living room, gun in hand, pointing to my face. He was yelling that if I didn't give him respect, that he may as well kill me. "You're not going to shoot me," I said far more calmly than I felt. Inside, I was crapping my pants, despite the fact I honestly did believe he wasn't going to shoot me. I had been around guns before, but had never had one pointed at me. "Yeah?" he said. "Why do you think that?" "I know it. You're not going to shoot me because I'm one of the few friends you've got left." He seemed to consider this for a moment and finally lowered the gun. His face was still murder incarnate, but at least the gun wasn't pointing at me. "Can you move, man? I'm trying to watch Netflix." He continued staring at me for a long time, seemingly trying to internally fight himself before finally stomping back to his room. I didn't see him again for the rest of the night. A few days later, Steve and Greg asked me to sit down when I came home from my 3rd double in a row at the restaurant where I worked. I asked why, and they said, "We need to talk about me living there." I told them there was no need. I was moving out. They seemed satisfied with this, and I went to my room to get some much-needed sleep. As a side note, as I was moving out, I accidentally broke the handle of the storm door and Steve lost his mind, screaming at me and calling me all kinds of names, including the M-word. I assured him that I would replace it, but he just kept calling me names. Nick was helping me move out at the time, and once we were away from the house, he gave me a look that spoke volumes. "I know," I said. This was the point that I finally snapped and realized that Steve was nothing but a toxic piece of crap. It took someone I hadn't known for very long giving me a single look for that puzzle piece to finally fall into place and make me go, wow, he's a bag of dicks. After I moved out, I only saw Steve once. I was coming out of my class at the university campus and he drove up on his motorcycle and started trying to make conversation, but I just made some lame excuse about needing to get to work or home or something and walked away. About a year later, I blocked Steve completely on all social media, where he commented on a Facebook post and called my mum something horrible. I don't know why I didn't do it sooner. About a year after that, Nick and I were at the mall. Being on a bit of time crunch and needing things from different stores, we decided to head in different directions and meet in the food court. I finished what I needed to do first and was standing in front of Dairy Queen waiting for Nick to meet me, when I get a phone call from him. "What's up?" I said by way of answering. "I just saw Steve," he said without preamble. He was going to the store I was coming out of. He didn't need to tell me which Steve. He knew most of the words I've put into this story by this point, although I'm sure some of these anecdotes would have surprised even him. My heart seemed to seize and I couldn't breathe. I hadn't seen or spoken to Steve in over 2 years, and the thought of coming face to face with him now filled me with dread. "Hello, you there?" "Yeah, I'll meet you at the car." That's why I told you I'll be out in a bit. I practically sprinted to the car and just kept praying to whatever gods may exist that Nick would be out sooner. I went over and over in my mind what I would say if Steve did show up, but luckily I never had to find out, because Nick appeared pretty quickly and we left. That was the last I heard of him. These incidents that are portrayed in this story are not everything that happened over the course of my relationship with him. There were more, including more death threats, more physical altercations, more name-calling, and insurance fraud that Steve decided to rope me into without my knowledge. These were just the worst, or more poignant incidents that need to be told in order to paint Steve as he truly is. Were I to share the entire story of Steve, it would likely wind up being a whole novel. A lot of it, while terrible, isn't really that relevant in the grand scheme of things. So, there it is. I know at this point you're probably wondering, why didn't I just leave Steve in the dust a long time ago? Why didn't I just walk away from the friendship at the first sign of trouble? Well, there are a few reasons. First and foremost, Steve was a sociopath. They are extremely well versed in making people trust them, even as they treat them like trash. Not to mention he gaslit me, made me feel as though a lot of the smaller incidents were my fault, that in turn led me to believing the bigger problems were my fault too. This is how psychological abusers keep control. Secondly, I am a loyal friend to a fault. I will see the best in people I care about, even if they stab me in the back and beat me down. This is a fault of mine that I'm working on, and I only saw the terrible in Steve when he treated another friend I was loyal to like crap. A part of me was also terrified to walk away. There was a piece of me that was scared, and sometimes still is since I blocked him, that he would get it in his head to kill me because I rejected him. This is again part of the conditioning that abusers do, but regardless, I'm much happier now the whole thing is behind me. I'd like to end this on a final note. If you're in a relationship of any kind and you start to see red flags, don't ignore them like I did. I explained away a lot of the red flags that Steve was waving proudly, and I regret it to this day. I was lucky. I got out of the most toxic friendship I've ever known, with only some psychological trauma and having my confidence shattered. But it could have ended so much worse. If you need help getting out, seek it immediately. Leave everything behind if you have to. Things can be replaced, but you cannot be. Thanks for listening. And Steve, please stay away from me. I never want to see or hear from you again. Hey guys, well done for making it to the end. And thank you for listening. I hope you enjoyed that really long story. If of course you did, you can let me know in the description. Gosh, Steve really is so toxic. Well, there you go. Just crazy how, you know, things just go ticking along, and it's only until it's too late that you realize, yeah, that he's a bag of dicks, as the writer put it. There you go. If you liked today's video, please be sure to let me know. There will be another video on Sunday, compilation day. What do you guys think about this new schedule? Wednesday, Friday, Sunday? I know, it went from Monday, Wednesday, Friday to Tuesday, Thursday, Saturday. Now just Wednesday, Friday, Sunday. But yeah, I'd love to get your thoughts on this. Because if everyone's happy with the new schedule, then just keep it. And I'd like to extend a huge thanks, as always, to my members, patrons, and supporters on Ko-fi. Your support and contributions are immeasurable, and I'm so grateful for your help. Thank you. But for now, I'm going to leave you, because I am actually going to go... Well, I'm recording it now, I'll edit it after, but I'm actually going to go see... I can't believe I've forgotten. Back to the Future, the musical. Alright then, guys, I better go. Gotta leave now. I'd have watched it by the time you hear this. So it must have been great. Bye!